Today, I will be filling up this sketchbook page and talking you through my process. Also, if you've ever heard someone say it's cheating to use references, or that if you were a real artist, you would be able to draw just from your imagination, we're going to be talking about that as well. So right now in my observational drawing class that I teach, we've been studying portraiture, and I spend time going over each facial feature and the anatomy of each, so that kind of inspired me to do some studies of eyes, but specifically I wanted to work on my hatching technique for shading, which you'll see later on. You'll notice that when I'm drawing an eye, I like to start out drawing a circle. For facial features and portraits in general, I like to really remember the anatomy and the three-dimensional forms that I'm drawing. So an eyeball is, of course, literally a ball. So I start with a ball, a circle, and then draw the eyelids wrapping around it. And that kind of helps me to keep the 3D form in mind. It's not completely necessary. It just is more helpful for me mentally to be visualizing that. And then since I've already drawn that circle, that will guide me when drawing the crease above and below the eye, since those sit around the eyeball. So my circle just helps place those. I also always focus on showing the thickness of the eyelid as well. It's not just like a paper thin flap. It does have a thickness to that, and I feel like that's easy to forget and can really make a difference in the realism of your drawing. So as I was doing this sketchbook page, I was thinking a lot about using references in art, since I use references when drawing portraits or facial features. And sometimes I'll have students in my classes, I teach high school, that seem to have this idea that using a reference is cheating or not creating real art. And this idea seems to mostly come from either beginners or people that are not very familiar with art or haven't taken an art class before. Because as soon as you take an art class, you'll usually, depending on the class, quickly realize how much references are used, whether it's live models in a figure drawing class or photos. So let's talk a little bit about using references, why it's important to do so, and when it might start limiting you as you create. I think any negativity about using references does a really big disservice to anyone starting out in art, because if you think you can't use a reference, you're gonna really struggle and honestly most likely give up as soon as you realize that anything you try to draw from your head turns out horrible. I feel like most people, obviously there's prodigies and exceptions, but most people, if I told you to sit down and draw a hippo or a cheetah from memory, you would probably not do like a super realistic job. Unless, obviously, you're an artist that regularly draws those animals, so you have a visual library and muscle memory built up. And visual library just means that you've looked at so many references and drawn it so many times that you have a much more accurate picture in your head of what something looks like. I don't honestly look at hippos or cheetahs very much, so I'm not super confident that I would draw it very accurately. When you're first learning to draw, you'll probably heavily rely on references, but even as a more experienced artist, every time you draw something that you're not familiar with, you'll probably need to look at references or study it from life first. If you've never really drawn the New York City skyline, I would be very impressed if you could just pull that out of thin air and draw it. As you grow in your skills as an artist, there should be a shift in how you use the references. So in the beginning, you might heavily depend on a reference as your main idea for an artwork. But as time goes on, you'll probably start wanting to create more of your own ideas. So you might not have a reference photo for that idea in your head. So instead of duplicating a reference like you did in the past, you might instead do something like pull together 5 references and just pick and choose elements that you need to help you create your own artwork. Or you might set up and take your own reference photo that perfectly executes your vision. The reason why it can be a little more negative if you only draw from references is there will be times in your career as an artist where you may want or need to draw something that you don't have a reference photo for. Or you might have a reference photo, but you want to draw that object in a different position or maybe change the lighting. So if you're only comfortable exactly replicating a photo, then sometimes it can be a little bit limiting. Something that can really help you in this area, if it's an area of weakness for you, is studying perspective and also how to rotate simple shapes in space. As you grow those skills, you'll better be able to draw scenes or objects placed how you want them without needing an exact reference. Now, there's certain careers or areas of art where you really need to have strong skills in drawing from imagination. For example, like storyboarding or comic artists, those are two that I can think of off the top of my head, because you need to easily be able to draw people and objects in different positions and manipulate them. But then there's other artists like landscape oil painters who work completely either from life, working plein air, or from reference photos that they take themselves, and that's totally fine. There's really no reason they need to be creating landscapes from their imagination. That would be a weird rule that would make no sense. So it just kind of depends on the type of art that you make. One last thing I wanted to touch on about references is copyright. Back in the day, when the old masters were painting before cameras were invented, they were obviously working from life. Real landscapes, real people. So there's no issue about copyright. But now we have the blessing of being able to use photos. This is where it starts to get a little bit dicey if we're not careful, because photography is a form of art. So if you're taking a reference and you're using the exact composition, the exact lighting, all of that, and you're recreating it as your own artwork, you're taking those elements from the artist that took that photo and making them your own. This is why a lot of artists will encourage taking your own reference photos so you don't even have to worry about that. So I feel like this is where the negativity about references kind of comes from, either the copyright issue, or if you're completely stuck having to use references and you can never kind of go off the book or draw something without an exact reference. Overall, I feel like it kind of depends on the person and the type of art they create, how much they use references. I personally use them a lot, especially if I'm just practicing in my sketchbook. I'm not really worried about where I'm getting my photos. I'm just drawing to learn. But I also don't like being completely tied to having to use a reference. So it's an area that I want to keep working on and practicing my skills, drawing in perspective and rotating basic shapes and all of that. Also, probably a good portion of the artists you've learned about in your art history class also used references. They just maybe didn't have photography, so they were working from life. That actually reminds me, I'll insert a picture of what it looked like when artists would use grids back in the day. I don't know what year it is. We can obviously use grids today by putting a grid on your reference photo, but they used grids even before photography as well. So, and artists like Van Gogh, I think, used a grid. There's other ones as well that I can't think of, but all these things that we consider like, I don't know, cheating or things like that, they're all tools that artists have used for centuries. Okay, back to my drawing. So as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to shade these using hatching. If you don't know, hatching is just like repetitive lines closely spaced and parallel to each other. So you can build on top of them with different pressure to get like a variety of tones. Normally in the past, I've done more cross hatching, which is where you overlap the lines in different directions to get the darker tones. But for whatever reason, I feel like I can never get the look I'm wanting to achieve. So this time I decided to do just the hatching, and I'm much happier with how it turned out. I focused on just going one direction with my lines. Obviously, I turned the direction when I needed to communicate the shape of the form, but I was trying to avoid any really perpendicular lines unless like totally necessary. And then I just continued to darken areas that needed to be by going over that area again in the same direction. Whereas in the past, I probably would have turned and cross-hatched if I was trying to get that darker shade. Also, whenever I do shading, I really try to focus on having the whole value scale. So really bright highlights, really dark shadows, and a whole range in between. Whenever you feel like your shading is not looking right, just try to create more contrast. 9 times out of 10, that fixes the issue, and you just need your darks like a little bit darker. overall, I was happy with how this page came out. I liked the look of the hatching, and it was also just kind of enjoyable and relaxing to do. I feel like I go through phases where I have a really strong urge to just do like graphite shading with no color, but I think I scratched the itch and I am ready to go back to color again. Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything I talked about as well, using references or hatching or drawing faces, anything like that. And I'll see you again in a couple of weeks.